Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rebecca Wastenberg, Research Fellow with the Emerging Technologies Institute at the National Defense Industrial Association. Thank you to all our attendees for your support of NDIA and ETI, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Forever Chemicals 101 with Dr. Caitlin Darden. This webinar is part of our Tech 101 series, where we present complex technological concepts as introductory webinars with a focus on their national security implications. In today's world, we're often bombarded with headlines and nicknames intended to incite unnecessary fear. However, in the case of PFAS, the moniker of Forever Chemicals, it's quite apt. PFAS are a large group of heat and stain-resistant chemicals first developed in the 1940s. PFAS are used in a wide range of products, including carpet, nonstick cookware, waterproof clothing, and firefighting foam used at airports and military bases. PFAS can persist in the environment, including in the water, soil, and air, for decades or longer, quite literally forever. While there has been a recent push to phase out these chemicals globally, legacy uses and a lack of commercially viable alternatives for certain safety products, such as firefighting foams, have resulted in PFAS contamination in multiple locations across the country. The current focus of research includes identifying and testing technologies and methods to better assess the health risks of these chemicals, as well as improve the detection and treatment of PFAS in the environment. This presentation will discuss the basics of PFAS chemicals and their prevalence, illustrate the importance to and the role of the Department of Defense in the management of these chemicals, and discuss efforts underway to replace these chemicals, including requirements to replace DoD's firefighting foam. Attendees will get an overview of ongoing DoD and government activities to develop and validate the technologies necessary to address the issue of forever chemicals. Some admin remarks before we get started. All attendee lines are muted. If you have a question during the webinar, you can submit your question in the question box in the webinar panel on the right side of your screen. We'll do our best to get through as many questions as we can during Q&A. We are recording today's webinar for members unable to attend and for any member who wishes to review the material at a later date. Within the next few days, we'll also post the recording to YouTube for your review. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Caitlin Darden. Caitlin is a senior analyst with the Science, Technology, Assessment, and Analytics team at the Government Accountability Office, or GAO. In this role, she reviews scientific programs funded by the US government to produce audit reports and technological assessments for congressional decision makers, federal agencies, and the broader public with independent, nonpartisan advice on various topics. Her area of focus includes foreign conflicts of interest surrounding US-funded research and development, including critical and emerging technologies, elements of biological warfare, past and present, and the use, oversight, and control of dangerous chemicals in the US. Dr. Darden has her PhD in forensic anthropology and genetics and served as an identification specialist for both the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency and the City of New York prior to her time at GAO. She's well-versed in the unique aspects of applying broader research and security concerns to the nuances of the military sector. Caitlin, over to you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Really happy to be here. Let me just start my screen share. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. So yes, today we're talking about forever chemicals, the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances that are commonly known as PFAS. And I'll try throughout this presentation to keep to the acronyms, which might be more familiar to you from hearing things in the news and reading articles. Excuse me. So as Rebecca was saying, what are PFAS? PFAS are a large group of synthetic chemicals that have a wide variety of synthetic uses in consumer products. And while at least 4,000 have been identified, only about 1,500 distinct PFAS have made their way into a wide range of commercial and consumer products in the US, including, as you can see here, carpet, food packaging, nonstick cookware, waterproof clothing, firefighting foams to suppress aircraft fires, and a ton of other things, including cosmetics. The interesting thing about PFAS is that they have a carbon-fluorine bond. This is one of the strongest organic bonds in existence. Because of this bond, which makes the substances resistant to degradation in traditional methods of environmental remediation and natural processes, some have characterized PFAS as these forever chemicals because although their persistence can vary, they can persist in the environment for years, decades, or longer. There are some PFAS where we just don't even know how long it will take for them to break down. This has led to PFAS hotspots at airports, military bases, and widespread environmental contamination of water, soil, and air. In addition to this, some PFAS bioaccumulate in animal tissue. And what this means is that in addition to direct exposure in contaminated water, soil, air, or consumer goods, people can be exposed to PFAS by consuming meat, fish, dairy products, and exposed livestock and wildlife. Little is known about most PFAS, but some have been shown to pose potential risk to human health. And according to the EPA, for the PFAS that have been studied, contamination over certain levels may have a variety of adverse effects on humans, such as effects on the immune system, thyroid, liver damage, and certain kinds of cancer. They've also been shown to transfer to fetuses in utero and even infants through breastfeeding. Unfortunately, PFAS assessment is limited, and our lack of knowledge on detection, lack of standards, and lack of treatment makes it very difficult to study, identify, treat, and destroy these chemicals. So to give a brief timeline on PFAS, as Rebecca mentioned in our opening, scientists developed this class of heat and stain resistant chemicals in the 1940s. And from the 1940s to the 1980s, there was a large scale production of various forms of PFAS for, like I said, applications for nonstick coatings, water resistant products, protective coatings, waterproof fabrics, even architectural resins. One of the biggest issues at this time was the 1967 carrier fire on the USS Forrestal, which was stationed off the coast of Vietnam. This fire resulted in the deaths of 134 service members, and it was following this event that the Department of Defense began using what we call firefighting foams containing PFAS to fight the fuel fires that were related to military uses. Jumping ahead a little bit, since 1999, CDC, so the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, have put out a National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which has measured PFAS in the blood of a representative sample of Americans. Unfortunately, the survey has found that most people in the US have been exposed to two of the most widely studied PFAS, PFOA, which we'll call PFOA, and PFOS, which we'll call PFOS. And according to the CDC, people are most likely exposed to these two PFAS by consuming water or food that contains it. Water may become contaminated by PFAS as a result of chemical releases into the surface or groundwater, such as manufacturing sites, landfills, aviation fire training areas where they use this firefighting foam, or wastewater treatment facilities where they're trying to clear this out of the water. But between 2000 and 2002, PFOS was voluntarily phased out of production in the US by its primary manufacturer. And then 4 years later, in 2006, 8 of the major companies responsible for creating products with PFOA and PFOA-related chemicals voluntarily agreed to phase out their global production. And although there are a little limited number of ongoing uses, these two have seemed to leave the marketplace. Unfortunately, there are still some legacy uses of both of these, and similar chemicals have replaced them along the way. During this time as well, there was an increase in regulations such as the Toxic Substances Control Act, which some of you might know as TSCA, which authorized the EPA to review chemicals already in commerce and chemicals yet to enter commerce to obtain more information on the effects of these chemicals on human health. And EPA was able to determine if these pose an unreasonable risk to human health or the environment. Since then, EPA has used TSCA to require companies to provide the agency with significant new uses of certain PFAS products before those products are manufactured, imported, or sold in the US. EPA also put forward its first set of provisional health advisories in 2009 for these two most common PFAS, again, PFOA and PFOS. Since this time, over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a huge surge of public awareness about PFAS. There are state, regional, independent consortia and task forces that deal with local contamination and factors of environmental justice, as well as private companies spearheading research into detection and treatment. Globally, there have been longstanding moratoriums on PFAS production and usage. And in the US, EPA has established lifetime health advisories at the levels of parts per trillion. So for those of you unfamiliar with this designation, it's basically the same as a 30-second span in a million years. And they have asked that there's certified detection methods for different water sources and PFAS reporting so that we can be very clear about what, as a nation, we're ingesting in our water. In addition, DoD specifically has been directed to cease their usage of PFAS-containing firefighting foam and implement alternatives by 2024, which we'll talk a little bit more about shortly. So as you see here on the left-hand side of the slide, these are the 2022 interim lifetime health advisory levels from the EPA. And as you can see, what they're saying is safe and recommended are very, very small quantities. And this is something that they've been working on for many years to understand the effects and making sure that these are actually health advisories so that you can stay healthy if your exposure remains below these limits. So here's just kind of an additional explanation of all the ways that PFAS can get into the environment. Like I said, it can come through firefighting foam, seeping into groundwater from military bases. Also something called leachate, if any of you are familiar with landfills, and this is where PFAS containing materials may be disposed of, can be in biosolids, which are the sludges and byproducts from wastewater treatment plants. It can also be deposited on agricultural lands as fertilizer, run off into surface water, can be discharged as wastewater effluents, and industrial manufacturing sites. So all along the way, there are many ways where it can get into the environment. And so the big question is, how do we get it back? In fact, in September of 2022, the GAO found that at least 18% of over 5,000 water systems in Illinois, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Ohio, and Vermont had concentrations of those two most common PFAS above the levels of which adverse health effects have been identified. So this is not something that's just theoretical. This is not something that's just happening around military bases. It's something that's pervasive throughout the country. So there are some current challenges with PFAS, as you can potentially imagine. The first category is understanding exactly what the health assessments are. So according to the EPA, it would be impossible to expeditiously study the risk that all PFAS pose to human health if they were researched one by one. As you heard me at the beginning, there are thousands of PFAS that we know about and can distinguish, and there might be thousands more that we're still not sure of because PFAS can break down into other forms of PFAS as it disintegrates. But due to the small number of PFAS that have actually been studied, there's limited information on the health outcomes. What is out there is, for example, this PFAS tox database, which I highly recommend you check out if this is of interest to you. And it lists out by type of study, so human, animal, in vivo, all the information there are of all the PFAS that are out there and what they've been linked to in terms of human health effects. But according to federal agencies, the technologies that do exist cannot reliably predict the complex health outcomes, such as developmental and repeated exposure toxicity. The second challenge is that the diversity of PFAS and the lack of understanding of their fate, transformation, and behavior in humans creates a barrier to the use of predictive technologies and methods. So any of you familiar with AI or machine learning, this has been applied very extensively to the health assessments of PFAS. but there's just not enough reliable data sets out there or an understanding of the biological characteristics of this chemical in order to train the machine learning models. We found in a few GAO studies that the results of one machine learning study, which combined a couple of different machine learning processes, was limited to predicting just the biological activity of when a human is exposed to PFAS. So what are the actual reactions, not necessarily the health outcomes. Second is detection. So now that we know that PFAS can get into the environment and has been found in the environment and has been found in humans, how do we know it's there? How do we know what's there? And unfortunately, that's a huge question. The cost of sampling to get to those answers is challenging. Academic experts say that it could cost up to $500 per sample, and instrumentation like the ones you see here, which is an example of mass spectrometry to analyze the specific PFAS that might be in a sample, could initially cost over $500,000 to acquire and set up, and then an additional $250,000 a year to maintain and operate. And these costs are very prohibitive for private owners, small utility companies, local towns and regions to maintain to understand what's in their water supply. There's also varying guidance and regulations that vary by state. States differ in their PFAS that they regulate. As I mentioned, we are talking about thousands. Some of them have identified 36, 70, 52. Some of them stick to the top two of PFOA and PFAS. So there's no real standard on what we are looking at. And there's a lack of analytical standards and methods that are coming from EPA that have been verified and validated, because it's just so hard to test them and prove that they work in different situations. So if there's not a lot that's there that can validate it, everyone's kind of on their own to try to solve the problem. And that leads, unfortunately, to the biggest issue of treatment. Again, cost of full-scale treatment is uncertain because we just don't know what's out there. We don't know the best way to deal with it. In addition, federal guidance regarding PFAS disposal can make state and municipal landfill operators hesitant to accept PFAS waste because they just don't know what they're going to be dealing with. And even DoD experts we spoke with also noted they continue to be challenged by the scarcity of, again, validated and approved disposal options. And unfortunately, as of this spring, no PFAS destruction technologies have been effectively demonstrated to fully destroy PFAS at full scale. So we still don't have a solution. Current full-scale destruction technologies are not optimized for PFAS destruction. And most of the new technologies still at the research stage. More than that, some PFAS compounds are more difficult to break down, which can limit the effectiveness of treatment and increase the cost of remediation and the length of time to actually get things done. There are some emerging technologies that have been pioneered. PFAS destruction in terms of incineration is one of the ones you've probably heard the most about. There was also a moratorium put on that for DoD to use it. I'll talk a little bit about that moratorium later, but it's an ongoing issue. And there also seems to be a combination of factors because you have to have a high energy consumption, what the potential impacts might be, production, cost, usage, and what's potentially out there for use, like I had mentioned, has not been validated for PFAS. So what you see in the left-hand center here is there are some what we call deep injection wells in the US in about 20 states. And these potentially could be good treatment options to dispose of PFAS containing materials. However, as of December 2020, only 2 states have actually been using this in these wells, and there is no standard to test whether the materials are staying in the wells or seeping through the groundwater. So as you can see here, we're talking about health issues, detection issues, and treatment issues for these chemicals. And while it might be a kind of a scary, not good news story, the point is we know we have a problem and we're trying to find the best way to resolve it. So why should the defense sector care? Well, PFAS is used to provide military clothing with durability and waterproofing to improve the wear and fire resistance of engine components in electronic wiring in military aircraft and in firefighting foams commonly used to suppress fires involving aircraft, among other uses. At the very simplest sense, it's pervasive. in the defense sector. As you can see here, this is an example of a PFTE, chem bioprotection suit. These suits are used to provide a barrier to military warfare agents like VX, which is a neurotoxin, and sarin gas. Because these suits maintain a performance even after exposure to common contaminants like gasoline and seawater, they're the best option to protect our warfighters. But you're putting them in a suit covered in PFAS. So you have to balance the protection aspect with the additional risk. As you see here, everything highlighted in this fighter jet is also an example of where PFAS materials are used. And needless to say, they are vital to our warfighting aircraft. And below, this is the one we've been talking about the most. This is an example of what you might have heard as AFFF, which is aqueous film forming foam. This is that PFAS foam that is used on jet fuel fires and aircraft carrier fires. This is what keeps our warfighters safe in those high burning fuel fires, but it is also the main reason for PFAS contamination on military bases. So again, why should we care? Well, a lot of this comes down to, like I said, the use of PFAS in the military sector and everything that has come as a result of it. So many of you might be familiar with the National Defense Authorization Acts, the NDAAs. And in the most recent four, there have been a lot of attention put to PFAS. So in the 2020 NDAA, there were guidelines for DoD to dispose of certain materials containing PFAS. But again, we go to the question of what is the best disposal method? What can be validated? They also included provisions to facilitate DoD sharing of PFAS monitoring data with states and municipalities, much better communication, especially for those areas where there have been spills, there have been monitoring to make sure that the local towns, local facilities, and local populations understand if they're at risk for PFAS in their water supply. It also calls on DoD to ensure that a PFAS-free firefighting agent is available for use by October 1st, 2023, and that they should halt all use of PFAS-containing foams at installations starting on October 2024. So as you guys can see, this is something that should have been in effect last year, and we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. And then in the 2020 NDAA, they also required DoD to establish a PFAS task force. This is where they put a temporary moratorium on PFAS incineration by DoD. Well, at the time, and even through today, incineration is considered the best option that we have. It is still something that we don't understand, and we can't really measure how much PFAS is actually destroyed by incineration, how much becomes aerosolized and goes into the air, and how to collect and deal with all of the after effects of this, which is why the moratorium was put into place. It also required full public disclosure of the results of DoD PFAS water testing, so that, you know, for someone like me who grew up near a military base, we would be able to understand if PFAS was used on that base, whether or not there were spills, there were concerns, whether DoD has found it in the water supply. And it also extended DoD's authority to pay for studies and assessments of health implications that they've done in conjunction with the CDC and NIH to better understand what the actual health effects are of PFAS contamination. And this has been because, again, it's not just for, you know, DoD warfighters, the risk of having water contamination or food contamination. For the warfighter, they're exposed to it in so many more ways and directly on their skin for long terms. And what does that mean? And then more recently, in this year's NDAA, they put forward two amendments. The first amended the 2022 NDAA to basically allow any remediation or disposal technology that has been approved by the EPA. And this was huge. So if EPA has said that this works, DoD can apply it. It also amended the 2021 NDAA, which we didn't really talk about here, but to extend the time frame in halting the use of excuse me, of PFAS containing firefighter foam. I did put forward that it originally came out in the 2020 NDAA, that they had until the October 1st of this year, 2024. But due to the fact that they're still undergoing research into something that's going to be as effective and as safe for the firefighters, they've extended that deadline to 2026, as well as giving them additional funding to find better uses, better methodologies, and better ways of handling PFAS, especially in firefighting foam. I know I threw a lot at you, but I'm just want you to understand that this is something that many different levels are very aware of and are trying to make sure that our warfighters, the defense sector, is readily equipped to deal with now 70 years worth of usage and potential leaks and spills that they've had to deal with, and also trying to look forward and find better means of doing the same thing. So in a September 2023 briefing to Congress, DoD recommitted to mitigating PFAS in the drinking water it supplies, as well as addressing releases in the environment around DoD sites resulting from DoD activities. In general, the department has responded quickly with short and long-term actions to ensure that no one is drinking water with PFOS or PFOA, again, those two most common types, above what is the current accepted limit of 70 parts per trillion. As I mentioned, there is an interim lifetime health advisory from EPA that's much, much lower than that, but it hasn't been enacted yet. And the department is preparing to implement that national drinking water standard once it is final. The department also has made significant progress and continues to address the effects of PFAS releases to protect the health of its service members, their families, the DoD civilian workforce, and the community in which DoD serves. So I wanted to give you guys this link for those of you interested, because DoD, as of March last year, has identified 707 installations in which there may have been usage or release. And if you click this link and there's anything by you, you can actually check out and see which level of removal actions they're at. So whether it's a preliminary assessment or site inspection, whether they've identified anything, if they started remedial treatment, or if there's a long-term management plan in progress. And one of the biggest site issues is actually out on Pearl Harbor Hickam, where there have been a spill at the Red Hill site. And there's some ongoing work there looking at whether or not that has entered into any of the wells. And that's probably one of the biggest examples of how DoD has been actively using the modern detection, treatment, and other methods to try to apply how that is affecting, especially on an island. But I highly recommend, if any of these sites look like they're near you, check them out. It's really good information on if there could have been potential exposure in your area. So as I said, a lot going on with DoD actions to address PFAS. Congress directed DoD to stop purchasing certain products as well as using the AFFF foam. GAO did a report in April of last year that DoD had taken some steps to do this. However, they had not assessed to prevent your military exchanges from procuring and reselling certain PFAS-containing items. The department as a whole had stopped it, but when it came to individual commerce, it's something that is still a potential out there. So in terms of putting your warfighters at risk in just buying non-stick coating pans or anything like that, it's hard for them to track it. Additionally, DoD had not updated its sustainable procurement guidance to implement these policies or regulations. Because GAO also found that the information available to guide DoD's actions was limited, and that's kind of par for the course with everything for PFAS. The guidance, the methods, the acceptable regulations are just not quite up to where we would like them to be. In addition, DoD did meet its 2023 deadline of October 1st to find a potential different use for firefighting foam, a non-PFAS firefighting foam. So the Army, Navy, and Air Force are combining to evaluate available technologies. They qualified their first product, and they call it an F3. It would be fluorine-free firefighting foam. And so the fluorine-free is the PFAS alternative. And I do recommend that if you're interested in what the specs are on this, there is a mil spec that was provided for these systems, and it has great detail on what kind of methods they're using, things that they discounted as not viable, and all of that. They also have stopped actually using it for training purposes, which is great, because that seemed to have been one of the biggest issues. Again, if you're training firefighters, you want them to be able to use the chemicals and processes that they will be using in a real fire, but then again, you're adding risk to the environment because now you have to clean up every training school. And DoD on its own, in addition to EPA, the private sector is continuing research into disposal and destruction methods. In July of last year, it lifted its congressional ban on PFAS incineration so that they are able to use it. They also endorsed 3 other disposal methods. So they're trying to make sure that there's enough options out there to find ways of getting rid of PFAS in the materials, soils, water, anything that is on DoD bases that DoD has had an activity with. And also in June of last year, they issued a special study considering the applicability of supercritical water oxidation for the treatment of PFAS. Now, supercritical water oxidation might sound really intimidating. It's also known as SCWO. And what it really is it just uses an intense chemical reaction, high temperatures, and pressure to break that carbon-fluorine bond that I talked about. It's achieved 99% destruction of targeted PFAS in pilot studies, but it has not been implemented at full scale. So it's one of those options that DoD is exploring and makes them actually on the cutting edge on some of these disposal and destruction technology methods. So it's not just DoD who's involved. Obviously, unfortunately, they're probably the biggest bad actors, but it is a government-wide effort to understand, identify, assess, and mitigate all of the issues concerning PFAS. As you see here, obviously the EPA is involved, CDC, NIH, FDA, but also NASA, NIOSH, OSHA. It's a full-scale effort to make sure that there's understanding for what's going on and ways to remediate it and keep the military and the public safe. You'll also see a lot of interest in this from Congress. Obviously, anything that came into the NDAA was from congressional write-ups, so they have a vested interest. In the Senate, it's your HISGAC, your Armed Services, Environment and Public Works. In the House, it's Science and Space, House Armed Services, and House Committee on Energy and Commerce. And these are also the individuals who are asking organizations such as GAO to look into specific aspects of this and see what can be done if there are congressional mandates, congressional authorities that need to be involved, that need to be broadened so that agencies have more access and leeway to do what needs to be done in order to solve these issues. And I'm just going to wrap up by letting you know that there is a lot going on with PFAS right now. It is something that is probably one of the most active topics in Congress and in agency actions. So I only went up to February 2024 as the most recent, but there are anticipated changes coming even probably as we speak. It will be a couple of days of when this presentation goes live. Everything from new regulations to, to protect communities from PFAS and other emerging chemicals of concern, better methods to measure certain types of PFAS. EPA is continuously reevaluating the methods that they put out there, making sure they can verify and validate them. There's a couple methods that I would recommend you check out if you're interested in different types. So EPA finalized method 1633, which is for wastewater, surface water, groundwater, biosolids, as well as method 1621, which can screen for the presence of chemical substances that contain the carbon-fluorine bonds that are included in PFAS. And the big one is what they call other test method, or OTM 50, which measures 38 volatile fluorine compounds in air. And that's going to be the biggest one for us moving forward, because if we can start measuring whether or not PFAS is ending up in air, We can measure any of the particles that are not destroyed from incineration, which can then validate the incineration method for PFAS. But also, we're talking a lot about forward-looking too, right? So preventing manufacture, processing of existing PFAS, preventing the creation and synthesization of any new PFAS. In 2023, there was an additional money available from the bipartisan infrastructure law to address emerging contaminants, such as PFAS in drinking water, hazard proposals, like I said, interim updated health advisories, and even FDA was working with companies to voluntarily phase out certain PFAS in food packaging. So hopefully I didn't scare anyone to go and get takeout, but you should know that coming up when you do get your takeout containers in the next couple of years, they should be free of PFAS. And it should be one less thing you have to worry about. But I highly recommend checking out these two links if you want more details on any of these ongoing studies. Like I said, it is a moving target. Every couple of weeks, you see something new. If you're very interested in understanding how this might affect you in your local area or your local DoD facility, check out the link that I sent for the 707 sites, but also look into any of the regional consortia in your area. There's a lot going on. You can learn more and you can get involved. And lastly, I would just recommend you check out these couple of GAO reports that we put out recently on some of the big topics, including the procurement of PFAS items, investigation of contamination. We have a couple new reports coming out in the next couple of months, as well as the technology assessment we put together for PFAS assessment, detection, and treatment. And then just GAO in general. This is one of our hot points. So we're always happy to talk to people about it, see what kind of interest there is. And other than that, I'm ready for questions. And I just like to thank you all for bearing with me. I'm 8 months pregnant and the little one decided in the last 5 minutes to keep kicking, so which is why I'm out of breath. So I do apologize.
Caitlin, thank you so much for that great overview. We have a lot of questions coming in, so bear with me. We're gonna get through as many as we can here. And feel free to take a breath if you need it. So the first, since you ended on kind of the note that GAO is doing a lot in this area, we had a question relevant to that I was hoping you could speak to. So one participant asked, does GAO have recommendations for DoD or the defense industrial based practices in this area, specifically regarding PFAS? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. So most of our recommendations are going to come from the more specific reports that I cited on slide 13. So I would say if people want more details, I recommend you go to that slide when the slide set comes out. Definitely on ways to help their procurement, making sure that they're getting the information they need and the guidance they need to put their policies in place, as well as how to deal with contamination. When it comes to the technologies for assessment, detection, and treatment, that one's a little different. That one we had recommendations or policy options more towards Congress as ways that they could facilitate both DoD, EPA, and others in being able to add to the scientific exploration and designation and validation of things. And I do know, all I can speak to is in the broad sense, but there are 2 more PFAS reports that are coming out within the next 5 to 6 months that have some more direct recommendations to DoD specifically on dealing with known contamination sites and remediation.
Great, thank you for that. One very specific question that was asked, why was PFAS incineration banned?
Absolutely. So I tried to get to that a little bit. Like I said, PFAS incineration was thought of as the best option. However, with that, there were so many unknowns where we did not know if, well, at the time, but now how much of the PFAS material was not getting completely destroyed and was being aerosolized. And if it's aerosolized, it's going to escape the incineration chamber. It's going to go into the water cycle. It's going to go back into the water. And it could be that it's now broken down enough to transfer into another PFAS. So if you knew you were incinerating PFOA, but the breakdown was something that you had not anticipated. Now you have to search for something that you don't know you're looking for in the water supply. So there were so many questions about what the after effects were, what any negative effects were, and how that might actually not solve the problem, that they wanted to put a moratorium on it, take a breath, see if there were alternatives. There were better ways to do it, because at that point it was, are we just substituting one PFAS for another in the contamination of the water and air supply?
Great. So we have a few questions asking specifically about things that DoD can do to identify PFAS. So one of those is, what can DoD do to better identify PFAS in their procured items? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I would direct everyone to GAO 23-105-982, which talks about the procurement items specifically, and it has a full list of those. But what it is understanding too is making sure that DoD is aware of the products that are known to contain PFAS, the suppliers of those products, understanding what that means for them, again, as an agency. And when you're talking about things that are bought at the agency level, it's very different, again, than talking about, let's say, exchange items. So when it comes to managing that, it has a lot to do with communication with other agencies, understanding what's out there, what the scientific literature says, what the recommendations are, and making sure that there, like I said, is guidance. And unfortunately, a lot of what that report found was that there's not guidance in creating those policies. And that's one of the recommendations we put forward, is that there needs to be more information given to DoD so they can make those distinctions, they can make those designations, and they can move forward. When you're talking about the agency level procurements, so unfortunately, the stuff that protects our warfighters, what's in the military aircraft, those firefighting phones. Firefighting phones is a big one. Aircraft, you're not touching it, so it's a little bit easier to deal with on a daily basis. It's in the components of the machinery, but it's things like those protective biochem suits, where we haven't found anything as protective as PFAS. So it's trying to balance, how do we protect our warfighter against these potential, sarin gas, neurotoxin attacks, and how do we protect them from the inherent risk of what might be coming into their skin? And that one's harder to talk about when you talk about procurement of items, because for many, having the best protection supersedes the risk of what the PFAS might do. Specifically for if you have an individual, let's say, who's only putting this suit on a couple hours every couple of years, or something like that, that's been the longest conversation with the DoD procurement of items, is we'd rather protect the warfighter with the best protection equipment and kind of figure out from there what to do at the side effects. And that's the biggest challenge, especially with the AFFF, and finding something that's going to fight the fires as fast and prevent it from reigniting. And then instead of dealing with the PFAS that goes into the water stream. So it's a very difficult conversation.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And we got a follow-up question also kind of on that same topic. Matthew Deal asks, can you comment on production of PFAS containing gaskets and electrical wiring being halted? Most of the items in your F-18 picture would be unavailable.
Yes, so I will caveat that I am not as familiar with the specific F-18 uses. That's from another sector. So our defense capabilities and management team with NGAO has done a lot of work on that side. And as of right now, there's not a halt in any of those being used. It's just more of an FYI that they are also PFAS containing elements. Again, there hasn't been any discussion, to my knowledge, of any viable replacements for that. And again, it's that risk factor analysis. If they're within the components of the machinery, such as the F-18, they're a little bit less risk of exposure to, let's say, the aviators, potentially to the manufacturers who are putting it together and the mechanics who work on the machinery. But again, it's the risk factor. We're more concerned, or DoD is more concerned with that immediate exposures So the foams, the water supply, the suits. But again, I would direct you to GAO for more of that. That specific report, I am not as familiar with, so I do apologize.
No, that's okay. So we had another participant ask kind of on a different topic. Shane Nicholas asks, what is the difference, if any, between PFAS and the VOCs found in the Camp Lejeune water? Is there a connection there at all?
So that is one of the ongoing studies that GAO is looking at. So I can't comment in detail on that, but there are relations. So one of the things I didn't get into because it's a lot of nuances, but if you're interested, I would highly recommend the GAO 22-105-088 report. That there's long chain and short chain PFAS, there's Gen X. A lot of these different monikers for variations of PFAS or the breakdown elements or the related fluorine containing chemicals are all in the wider family. So there is a relationship there. We are actively looking at a couple of spills like Lejeune, like I said, also the Red Hill. So I can't comment specifically, but if you want the details and you're versed enough in the chemicals, I highly recommend that report. And then also checking out that PFAS talks database, which breaks down the most common ones, where they are and what they're studied. And that will really help in identifying the names, because sometimes something comes across and you have no idea that it's PFAS related, and it really is.
Okay, thank you for that. So getting back to disposal methods, we have another question. This one's from Satya at BAE Systems. And Satya asked, what are the other 3 PFAS disposal methods that the DoD endorses?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great method. So like I said, they were working on the supercritical water oxidation as one potential method. And then if you go to the Department of Defense's PFAS task force database, which I link on slide 9, it will lay out all of them in detail on what they have been recommending as potentials. Since July 2023, I know they switched one out, so I don't want to give the wrong information, but they do have it all laid out there, and it links to the methods as well as EPA's assessment of those methods.
Great. So switching gears a little bit, we had an anonymous attendee asked, are there specific research areas that universities and other research institutions should focus their activities on when it comes to PFAS?
Absolutely. Again, I'm going to strongly say, please look at GAO 22-105-088. That was our technologies assessment, and that was our huge policy push. Is research needs to be done in detection and treatment, but specifically in understanding the best ways to detect, because there are differential ways of dealing with detection. So you can search for what you know is there. So looking for the known. You can look for any PFAS, which is considered a total fluorine assessment. So you're just doing a test to see if there's anything that might be PFAS there. And that's more searching for the known unknown. You know there's something there, but you don't know what it is. And then there's basically just kind of a blind look. And really, we know how to look for what we know could be there. So the PFOS, the PFOAs, the Gen X's, the legacy uses of PFAS, but it's the other ones where you think you know that there's PFAS in the environment, but you don't know which one. So you can't do a targeted analysis, or it's been there so long, you're concerned about breakdown. So there's long chain and short chain. Long chain can break down into short chain. So you could originally be looking for a long chain, but it's been so long, it's now broken down to a short chain. So detection in that total fluorine sphere is huge. Also, applications for cheaper, faster testing of all of these methods. If you're a university who has these facilities, getting in touch with EPA and volunteering to be a laboratory that can actually validate and verify existing methods. Like, you don't have to start from scratch, but if you can be one of those labs to help verify these methods, that's huge. And that's one of the things that gets these methods into the hands of DOD, DHS, DOE, all these facilities that need validated, verified methods. And that's one of the things that's been holding things back, because there's not labs out there who can test to see whether this is going to be applicable in all cases. And then on the treatment side, being inventive, looking at what's out there. There's things called granulated activated carbon, which is something we use in treating water anyway, but how does it affect PFAS? How long can you use it before you actually have to clean the GAC? How do you clean the GAC? Where do you do with the PFAS that was in the GAC? So those are the things where being inventive, being able to test what's already out there and to see how it might have PFAS applicable uses are what's really needed right now. Starting from scratch would be great if you think you have something new, but being there to support what's already underway is one of the biggest issues, is again, because there's not enough validated and verified methods. We need labs who can make sure that we can check those boxes and get methods out the door that we know are going to work.
Great. I'm glad you brought up granular activated carbon, because that was actually something somebody put in the comment box as well, just asking if you were aware of it. So it sounds like you are. Is there anything else you want to say about that?
Again, that technologies assessment that we did, for those of you who are well informed about PFAS, we do touch upon all of these. We talk about GAC, we talk about supercritical water oxidation, we talked about deep injection wells, we talk about everything that was current as of 2022 and what their uses was, and even some of the things that were in the trial and error phase. And so if you want some more information on that, please check that out. But those are the areas, again, where there's ongoing research, there's a lot of assessments, but it still comes down to full scale. Can especially small municipalities afford this? How do they use it? How is it applied? The conversation at the DoD level and the conversation at like a small wallet or utilities level are very different conversations. And that's one of the biggest issues too that we're seeing across the country, because this is not isolated to DoD facilities. This is a pervasive issue, and it's trying to find the things that work best for everyone in different situations.
So I think you touched on this question a little bit, but I do want to ask it specifically. Are there ways for interested private companies to get funding to clean up their practices?
Absolutely. So I think I mentioned that DoD specifically has gotten funding to look into ways to help them assess what they're doing. So if you volunteer through any of the DoD granting or contracting areas and you want to help them and help yourselves, there's also ways through the $2 million that went out recently, $2 billion from the Biden bipartisan infrastructure law to address emerging contaminants. So that's also an avenue, but also I highly recommend, and I think I mentioned this more if individuals were interested, but looking into regional organizations. They're also very good about explaining funding opportunities. Again, depending on what the situation is, if you want to clean up your own practices, if you want to assess whether or not you have concerns within your manufacturing process, if you want to stop manufacturing processes and find better ways, there are a huge number of avenues, but I would start there. The big things is that if you look up what it is you're looking for and put PFAS into the conversation, you'd be surprised what comes up. But there are funding avenues out there. There are a lot, especially if you're a small company, let's say, check out your regional consortia, your task force. If it's something that can help the local communities, especially where you're manufacturing or where you're using your products, they're definitely going to be interested in that. It's a huge issue at a regional level. You get a lot of individual organizations. You even get like the veterans associations in those local areas involved. So I would say start at that level and work your way out.
Great. So we only have a couple minutes left. Let's try and do maybe one, possibly two more. We've got a lot here still. So does the US government, especially DoD, engage in international collaboration when it comes to PFAS? What are our allies and partners doing? Is that something you've been tracking?
Yeah, so that's a lot that you'll see kind of in many of the GAO reports is what's happening in the US versus what's happening globally. And I spoke about it a little bit in terms of the PFAS timeline, but also kind of the history. So in general, Europe has been putting many more moratoriums out there on PFAS usage a little bit quicker than we have. We do collaborate in terms of what others are doing, but it's also hard in terms of importation and all of that. So when we're talking about regulations and policies, I spoke a little bit about how we have put regulations in place that EPA would review anything that's coming in from other countries that might increase the PFAS exposure for things that we can make here that don't have any high fluorine content. We do have a lot of consortia that work back and forth in terms of what's being done in Europe, what's being done here, what's the state of the union per se on PFAS globally. And a couple of those organizations do put out cross-reference, let's say, presentations, collaborations, conferences. So there is a lot of communication, but what it really comes down to is what are the laws, the regulations here that we can work within. And until those are adapted or changed, we can learn from them. We definitely do a lot of scientific exploration across the pond, but how does that apply, especially when you're pulling EPA in and they're like, sure, it works there, but we don't have a validated, verified method to make sure that it's going to work the same every time.
Great. Well, I think we're out of time to do more questions. Unfortunately, we didn't quite get through all of them. We got through a lot. But Caitlin, I just want to say thank you again for that fantastic presentation and all of your answers. We really appreciate it. I also want to just say thank you to all the attendees for all of the great questions. We're going to post the recording online as soon as possible. If the attendees have feedback on the Tech 101 series, especially topics that you'd like to see us cover in the future, please feel free to email us at eti@ndia.org. I also want to take this opportunity to highlight a few upcoming ETI events. On March 27th, we'll be hosting a webinar with Carnegie Mellon's Software Engineering Institute on the topic of addressing technical debt in software systems. Also coming up in our Tech 101 series on April 4th, we'll be covering GPS 101. On May 15th, we'll cover generative AI, a hot topic nowadays. And then on June 26th, we'll also be covering AI, but from the trustworthy AI perspective. Next, our second NDIA Emerging Technologies for Defense Conference will take place August 7th through 9th at the Washington, D.C. Convention Center. Confirmed speakers so far include Undersecretaries Hsu and LaPlante. Last year's event did sell out, including registrations, exhibits, and sponsorships. So look out for information on all of these opportunities, plus the opportunity to present some of your technical work. Those will be coming soon. To register for these and other ETI events, please visit www.ndia.org/events. Additionally, please check out the Emerging Tech Horizons podcast, available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, and most other platforms. Our recent episodes focused on the just released Directed Energy Supply Chain Study and the National Defense Authorization Act. Upcoming episodes will cover the Pentagon's new National Defense Industrial Strategy and the finalized PPBE Commission report as well. With that, thank you for joining us today and have a wonderful rest of your day.